The mysterious and strange world before the flood happened is a preview of what the tribulation is going to be like. Jesus called it the days of Noah. In both Matthew and Luke's gospel, Jesus equated the days prior to his return with the days of Noah, the mysterious world before the flood. Something modern Christians tend to either ignore or they focus only on one aspect of those days, that it was either violent or something about the Nephilim that walked the earth in those days. And we're certainly going to talk about both of those things today, but there was so much more that the Bible and the Dead Sea Scrolls present about those days that most have just ignored. And since we're headed directly toward the days Jesus warned us of, the days before his return, we need to learn as much as we can about them. This is Bible teacher Nelson Walters, and today we're looking at a different world. The mysterious world that perished in the Genesis flood. It was a world that was much more than we think. Most view this time as a small bunch of cavemen and women running around with sticks and stones, but apparently it was more than that, and they were much more advanced than that. Some may question if knowing about this world is important. They quote Luke 17:26-27. And just as it happened in the days of Noah, so it will also be in the days of the Son of Man. People were eating, they were drinking, they were marrying, and they were being given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. They'll say, all Jesus was alluding to here was that people from that time were oblivious to the destruction that was coming, and if they were oblivious, people today are going to be oblivious. They make that kind of connection, and that is a major, if not the major point of Jesus' discussion. But why were they oblivious? We need to ask that question. For that, Jesus expects us to dig back into our Bibles and find out the reasons so that we don't repeat the mistakes in today's modern world. That's a pretty big deal. And that is how Jesus and the apostles taught. They would give short explanations because they expected you to fill in the details on your own based on your own knowledge of Scripture. Not doing so is one way that people will be oblivious to the destruction that's coming upon the world in the days of the Son of Man. Now, when we're going to go back to discover more of what Jesus meant, we learn that the book of Genesis only provides us with 6 chapters of detail of that time period. But even in those 6 short chapters, God has given us amazing clues as to what things were like back then. For instance, what was the population size? I think it was much bigger than people have previously thought. Based on the genealogies from Genesis to the flood, it was 1,656 years from creation to the flood. During that time, if the growth rate was the same as it is in the year 2000 as it is now, which is 0.012 each year, then there would have been around 750 million people on the earth when the flood came. However, due to the extremely long lifespans of the people living during the flood, many were living as long as like 900 years, it's much more likely that the growth rate was much higher. If the rate was closer to 0.013, then the population would have been closer to 4 billion at the flood. Now, whatever, 750 million or 4 billion, this is still significantly larger than I think most of you in our listening audience have imagined. There would be vast cities, empires, etc. Things that we don't think about or consider today. There would have been kings. There would have been governments. Plus, that puts the 8 people who were saved in the ark in perspective, doesn't it? Only 8 out of 4 billion were deemed worthy to be saved by God, and they were all from one family. I think we vastly overestimate the number who will be saved in the rapture in this same way. So why only 8? Let's keep learning. And what about technology? The early period of human history may have been a lot more advanced technologically than we have previously assumed as well. Remember, the general consensus in the church is that these people were like cavemen. In Genesis 5, however, we learn that all the major technological advances that are recorded came from the children of one man. Lamech, a great-great-great-grandson of Cain. Don't you find that odd? I do. That his sons developed things like shepherding, music, metallurgy, etc., all from one family out of 4 billion people? And all these things were discovered in one generation. Again, don't you find that odd? And that's what the Bible tells us. I think they must have gotten a little help. Don't you? Now, according to the testimony of the patriarch Enoch, found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they did get help from fallen angels, that the technology was given to them by fallen angels. It's important to remember that the book of Enoch is not in the canon of Scripture, but it's quoted numerous times by the prophets, by Jesus himself, and by Jude, all of whom are in the canon. Enoch was also an eyewitness, if it is to believe that he actually had a part in writing some of this, to many of the things that were happening in those days. So we shouldn't just ignore his testimony. In an indirect way, the Bible actually confirms it, because one generation of one family could not discover music, metallurgy, and shepherding all at the same time, right? That we could all agree that would take hundreds, if not thousands of years. And that's how we have to read our Bibles, with a discerning eye for what it's really saying. And that's why you follow this channel, because we help you discover what you don't get elsewhere. We'd love you to become part of our community by subscribing. Subscribing is also the most powerful way that you can get YouTube and its algorithm push this video out to more people. Now, you may be familiar with the famous prophecy written in the names of the descendants of Seth. If you haven't, listen to this because it's pretty cool. Adam's righteous son and his line, when you take all their names together and you read the first 9 names in this line, the generations, of course, from Adam to Noah, in order, we come up with this amazing prophecy. Man is appointed mortal sorrow. The blessed God shall come down teaching. His death will bring the despairing comfort. That's the first 9 names if you read what they mean in order. In essence, it means that man is appointed to live a life of sorrow due to the fall. But God himself shall eventually come down from heaven, teaching us. That, of course, was Jesus who came down, and that his death on the cross brought the despairing comfort. That prophecy has been well known in many Christian circles for a number of years, and I think it's pretty cool. What this ministry discovered, however, 2 years ago, is that you can do the same thing with the unrighteous line of Cain and his descendants. If we read their names in order, we also get a prophecy. And that prophecy is just as amazing, if not even more. This is what it says. Man acquires teaching from a dragon destroyed by God. God will kill by the sword the despairing offspring of Cain in a stream at the blowing of the ram's horn. Like I said, that's a pretty amazing message, that Cain's offspring will acquire teaching from a dragon, or in other words, from Satan or one of his fallen angels, and then they will be killed in a stream or in a flood, which is exactly what happened. Interestingly, this also suggests that it happened at the blowing of a ram's horn. Exactly what happens on the day of the Lord at Jesus' final return when he blows the shofar. This, of course, is the original blowing of a ram's horn, and it's not in the biblical record, or really part of the record in any way, or found in the apocryphal books, just in this prophecy. But it's very interesting idea, since the flood was the first wrath of God, and the idea between the flood and what Jesus is going to do after his return are extremely similar. The takeaway from this amazing prophecy is that Cain's line were taught by Satan and his fallen angels, and this prophecy comes from the Bible, not from any other book that might be in question. So the pre-flood world, including technology that was fallen, came from fallen angels. The book of Enoch takes this further and explains that in addition to technology, they taught the people of earth about witchcraft and spells. These are important aspects to all keep in mind as we're comparing that world to our own. We also alluded to genetic manipulation in those days. Cain, of course, was Adam's first son, the one who killed his brother Abel. And Cain's line, the line of his posterity, ends abruptly with that generation who developed the ancient technology. Apparently, hundreds of years before the flood, as you will see. Why? Are his descendants the ones who interbred with the Watchers or the sons of God, as we learn about in Genesis 6, 1 through 4, and in the book of Enoch? Cain's last descendant was a female, Nama, which is kind of odd. She is mentioned, and then his line just ends. There are no more descendants. Why was she the last? Was she the final person in that line to be 100% human? Nama's name means beautiful one, and it's interesting that the Watchers found the daughters of men to be beautiful in Genesis 6. Again, a subtle clue in the biblical records. So the Watchers, or fallen angels, corrupted the human genome through genetic mixing with humans and also taught mankind to sin better by giving them technology to assist them in their sin. Cain and his descendants are, humanly speaking, a pretty impressive bunch. They build cities. They create technology, music, culture. Their daughters are renowned for their beauty. We don't hear any of that about the righteous line of Seth, the ones who survived the flood. The father of that final generation of Cain's is a man named Lamech. He is a violent, boastful guy who introduces polygamy by marrying 2 wives and writes a little poem about killing 2 men. He was a bigamist and a murderer, and his children were taught by fallen angels. Potentially, his daughter was given in marriage to the fallen angels as well, and his grandchildren probably were hybrid, or what the Bible terms Nephilim. So you are starting to see what Jesus' words in Luke 17 might mean beyond their surface meaning. Marrying and giving in marriage. Lamech sinned in marriage and in the giving in marriage of his daughter to probably a non-human. Jesus chose those words very carefully when he was describing the days of Noah. And when Genesis 6:5 tells us that the thoughts of people of those days were evil continually, we could see this in Lamech as well as in Genesis 6:11 when it speaks of the days being of great violence. Lamech is the poster child of the age before the flood. And when God decides to save the righteous, only 8 people are found worthy to get into the ark. We got to get back to that because that is very interesting. Now, this interbreeding and the technology was likely going on for centuries before Noah. In Enoch 6:6, we learn that the sons of God, or fallen angels, descended to the earth in the days of Jared, who was the father of Enoch. In fact, Enoch was born 1,000 years prior to the flood. So if Enoch is correct about when the fallen angels descended, they had 1,000 years to spread their genetic manipulation, their technology, and their black magic. No wonder the world was such a sinful place. Okay, so let's talk about Noah a little bit more. In Genesis 6:9, it says that Noah was righteous and blameless in his generations. What a very strange phrase. Righteous in his generations. It implies that what was handed down to Noah from his forefathers was righteous. What could that be other than his genetic material? So, Noah and his sons were righteous in their generations. They had righteous DNA, the original DNA created by God before the fallen angels began to manipulate the world by mixing their DNA with human DNA. So, was the reason that Noah and his family were spared, did it have something to do with their DNA? And will this be a problem in the world of the future? Is our DNA about to be compromised? Jesus said the days of Noah would be just like the days of the coming Son of Man. So, We need to think about this and be prepared for things like that. There are lessons to be learned by looking at the lifespans of Noah's father and his grandfather as well, something almost no Christians do. Now, in fairness, some scholars are aware that Noah's grandfather, Methuselah, who was the man who lived the longest of any human on the planet, has a name that means when he dies, it will come. In other words, when Methuselah dies, then the flood is going to come. And this is reasonably well known. Methuselah died, and in that very same year, the flood came. 1656 years after creation. But what is not well understood is that Noah's father died only 5 years earlier, hundreds of years younger than all the other generations before him or even after him, because Noah lived to be over 900 years old. Why did Noah's father die 5 years before the flood? Well, we don't know. It's not mentioned in the biblical record. But what was happening in the world at that time? It was a time of extreme violence. Men like Cain's descendant Lamech were running around killing people. There was probably lots of bloodshed. Was Lamech a martyr? In fact, were there many martyred people in the world at that time? Is that why only 8 people got on the ark and were saved? Would there have been hundreds or even thousands if they hadn't been killed by the unrighteous who were being very violent in those days? Another thing to keep in mind and just question as we're thinking about how the ancient world compares to our modern one. So for centuries, the world before the flood was able to forge metal tools that would have allowed them to build buildings, ships, farming equipment, fight wars with weapons, and all sorts of inventions. Now, we tend to view them as being primitive, but they could have been quite advanced because remember, they weren't coming up with this on their own. They were getting this technology from advanced fallen angels. Their tech could have equaled or exceeded our own. Now, I don't think it did, but it could have. Now, another clue that would have allowed the early humans before the flood to advance quite quickly is the ease of communication they had due to only having one language in the world. You know, God didn't separate people into multiple languages until the Tower of Babel. Before the Tower of Babel, people spoke only one language, which allowed them to work more efficiently with each other. Currently, we have progressed our technology really quickly over the last few years. However, how much more advanced would the world be if we all had one language? And as you know, there are the globalists in this world who would love to see that happen. So based on the Bible, we have a picture of a world of over 1 billion people with empires and cities, a world with 1,000 years of technology given them by fallen angels, a world where violence and witchcraft reigns. But the days of Noah may refer to more than just what was happening in that world. What if it actually refers to the physical days, the number of days that Noah spent in the ark? Will that equal the number of days the righteous are going to spend in heaven after the rapture? A really interesting question, because as you're going to find out, it appears these numbers are the same. So click right here to keep watching, because as crazy as this idea sounds, the Bible supports this theory in over 6 places. Till then, this is Nelson, and we'll see you there.